Good afternoon, everyone. This is Scott Wright. I'm the manager of the National Business and Disability Council. I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar series. Today, what the C-suite executive needs to know about disability inclusion. Our presenter today will be Ms. Carmen Jones. Carmen is the president and CEO of Solutions Marketing Group, a marketing consulting firm based in Atlanta, Georgia, with exclusive expertise in helping companies and government agencies build deeper, profitable brand relationships with the nation's 56 million people with disabilities. With over 20 years strategic consulting experience, Carmen is a leading expert on the dynamics and nuances of disability-focused branding and marketing, employment, and customer service. Carmen's insight has been featured on Roll Radio, CNN-FN, the New York Times, Black Enterprise, Glamour, New Mobility, and Essence Magazine. She regularly connects with audience through her workshops, training, and keynote. Carmen is a graduate of Hampton University with a BS in marketing. During her junior year, she was injured in an automobile accident resulting in paraplegia. Now, before I make my official introduction to Carmen, next slide, please. I'd like to talk about a little bit of housekeeping. So if you want to submit a question via our chat, do so through our Q&A window if you see it on the right side of your screen. Live captioning is located at the bottom right of the screen in the multimedia viewer. After this session, there will be a brief survey that you will be submitted with, and hopefully you complete that so we can have better webinar series going forward. And this presentation will be available online. So once again, today's presenter, next slide, please. Today's presenter will be Ms. Carmen Daniel Jones, the President and CEO of Solutions Marketing Group. So with no further ado, Carmen, please take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be with you all to share about what the C-suite needs to know to become more disability inclusive. Oftentimes, companies have very good intentions and they focus on the optics of being involved in the disability community, but not necessarily the outcome. So we're going to talk a lot about that. And one thing, Scott, while he shared my bio, but one of the things I'd like to add is that for the past few months, I've had the privilege of working with the NBDC team as their consultant to really create value-added services for corporate partners. So we've done some shifting and refocusing. You can expect from us in the coming weeks and months, executive roundtables. We're beefing up our job posting capability, targeted employment outreach in 15 key markets throughout the country, accessibility services, so that would include document remediation, also our Emerging Leaders program for college students with disabilities, helping our corporate partners develop their disability inclusive strategic plans, webinars, and also training and technical assistance. I wanted to make sure you all are aware of NBDC's depth and breadth, and hopefully we can have some discussions that add value to your companies. Next slide, please. So we're going to discuss today a few things. What is important for executives to know about the disability market? I've done a lot of these presentations. I share the fact many of you on the call or on the webinar have heard the same data shared in different ways. And it hasn't done a whole lot to necessarily change and shift what's happening inside of companies. So we're going to talk about what's really important for executives to know that can hopefully lead to action. We also will focus on ways to overcome barriers that impede disability inclusion, the elements of the disability inclusive or inclusion business case, how to support executives so they can effectively communicate, because a lot of times people don't know what they don't know. And so to be able to provide them with the insights and the data, if you will, or beyond the data, the best practices that they can communicate will help to shift what's taking place inside of companies. We'll also focus on methods to identify the departments that need to support executives, and then most importantly, how to measure the impact of disability inclusion. Next slide, please. So before we get started, I just want to get a pulse check in terms of where your organizations are. So do you believe your organization effectively integrates all aspects of disability inclusion into your organization's culture, including employment, customer service, and marketing? So you can answer by yes, we integrate all of these components well into our culture. No, we still need to grow in each of these areas. Or somewhat, we integrate one or two of these, but need to grow in other areas. And we'll wait a few seconds for you all to respond. Okay, so looking for the results to come in. If you haven't responded, please do so. So what we're hearing is an even split between yes, we integrate all of these components, so that's great, and then no, we still need to grow in each of these areas. So I'm hoping, it's our goal, that what's shared today will help to address B and C, so there's growth opportunities in all areas. Next slide, please. So I'm of the belief that in order to move forward, you have to look at where you are presently. So where am I and where are we? So what if we could do an assessment, you know, in terms of launching or beginning your disability inclusion strategy? It's important to know where you are individually, and by the virtue of the fact that you're participating, it leads us to believe that you're definitely more than aware. You know, you're engaged in hopefully moving to partnering and ownership. But then the real answer, or the real movement, occurs with where's my organization. So when we talk about awareness, we're talking about general awareness. Your organization may acknowledge July, the anniversary of the ADA, or October, which is the recognition nationally for National Disability Employment Awareness Month. If your organization is participating, you're attending conferences, you're getting information, but when you go, very little changes when you get back. You're possibly engaged. You're created a business resource group. You may have some executive level support, but there's nothing much more beyond that. The BRG has not been tapped to be a strategic, integral part of the diversity conversation. Or are you partnering? So are you participating with organizations and partnering with organizations like the National Business and Disability Council? And then lastly, you know, the ultimate goal is that you and your organization have shifted to ownership. So everyone from the CEO down to the customer-facing or public-facing staff is aware of what your organization is doing to become more disability inclusive and are engaged. All right, next slide, please. So when we define disability inclusion, it is the full integration of employment, customer service, and marketing with the full engagement and support of senior leadership into the organization's culture. So when we talk about disability inclusion, most people focus on the employment aspect, but to fully become inclusive, it's important that the guest experience or customer service component is addressed, as well as marketing. This changes the culture and allows prospective employees and consumers and their families to not only come to your company for services or products, but also as prospective employees. Next slide, please. So when we talk about what disability inclusion is, it's really important to know what it's not. So it's not filling quotas. It's not merely including people with disabilities in ads. You know, those ads you see probably around the Paralympics, where there may be, you know, a company may be a sponsor of the Paralympics, but when you really begin to peel back the layers of what they're doing internally, there's not a lot of substance there. I'm not knocking that support, but I'm just saying oftentimes we see that type of emphasis. It's not just attending events and galas. It's not just making donations through philanthropy or corporate social responsibility. It's not solely compliance, because compliance solely does not change an organization. It's not a special program or initiative. And lastly, it's not responding to trigger events. So meaning that if something occurs where the National Council on Independent Living takes a stand on a specific issue and they press on a company, then the company all of a sudden becomes disability inclusive, and we think about, we're focused on this segment. It's not just responding to trigger events. So, as much as it's important to understand what disability inclusion is, it's also important to understand what it's not. Let's go to the next slide. So what I have found, and what NBDC has found, that the state of disability inclusion within companies includes some of what you'll see listed here. So most companies focus solely on employment. In the past almost 30 years since the ADA became law, that's where a lot of companies have placed their emphasis. Many others focus on compliance as a primary driver for disability inclusion. So they check that box, and that's where it starts and ends. They also focus on self-surveys or pay-to-play lists and certifications used by nonprofits that raise money to create the illusion of activity, but nothing really changes. So I've had many calls with companies that participate in the surveys, and when we go further and probe and ask, okay, so tell me what's happened, tell me about your business resource group, tell me what your recruitment plan looks like. There's often silence. and a few companies have admitted, we have not really changed our practices as a result of these recognitions. So, that's one of the things that we're hearing. Despite the law, employment and people with disabilities remains unchanged. It's shifting some, but it's not shifting quick enough. Having awareness solely does not engage people with disabilities as employees and consumers. And companies are slowly recognizing the benefits of disability marketing and employment. So, for example, I just read today that Kohl's, the department store, has added adaptive clothing to 3 of their clothing lines. And they're not doing it just because it's a nice thing to do. They're doing it because they took the time to intentionally understand the needs of the market. They created a solution to consumers' needs. And in so doing, they're trying to drive market growth. It's not a feel-good activity for them. They're trying to drive market growth. Lastly, companies know they should engage, but they're often not sure what to do. And many times they're not sure where to start. And so, what doesn't get addressed also doesn't get done. And many companies remain stagnant in spite of their good intentions. Next slide, please. So while many of us have talked about facts, and I won't spend too much time here, but I'll just run through some basic facts. Again, knowing that this solely will not change thought leadership and decision makers' mindset about disability inclusion. But currently, or as of 2019, 20% of Americans of working age, that's between 16 and 64, who had disabilities, participated in the workforce. That's compared to 68% of Americans without a disability. So you can see that there's a big delta between those with disabilities that are working age that are in the workforce and those without disabilities that are also working. So there are also about 15 million people of working age with disabilities in the US, with 4.4 million of those working. So if we're going to add numbers to what that looks like, it's about 4.4 million people working. Now, this leaves a gap of about 10 million people for companies that could access them as potential employees who are not working. Employees with disabilities, and the data indicates that they're 48% greater tenure, so it's less expensive or costly for companies to keep employees on board. There's 34% fewer safety risks, and then 90% perform equal or better than those without disability, and absenteeism is 40% less. What's important about that is that that flies in the face of every myth that you've heard that people with disabilities have high absenteeism, that there's safety risks associated with having folks with disabilities. Quite honestly, and I'm preaching to the choir in part, people are grateful and not only not grateful, but they're loyal to their job because they recognize how much work it took to get that job. So they're less likely to leave, they're more likely to stay and to be really high performing individuals. Next slide, please. Additional facts, and you all can have this afterwards if we have a lot to go through. I'll go to that last bullet. Only 21% of employees with disabilities disclose that they have a disability. And I know for many of us, we understand why that's the case. For anyone who's new to the disability inclusion conversation as it relates to work, a lot of times people withhold, people that do not have visible disabilities withhold and don't self-disclose because they don't want it to impact their opportunity to get the job. So, that number is not surprising at all. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So additional facts, and I spend a lot of times working with companies that want to understand how to market to the disability community. So some additional insights include that people with disabilities and influencers and their families spend money with companies or organizations that understand them in 5 key areas. They focus on independence, or their ability to fully participate and having products and services and actual physical spaces that are accessible. Social connectedness, having the ability, of course, to relate to others, having access to the internet changed the game for many of us with disabilities in terms of just connecting and transacting business. Usefulness, being a contributing person, people want to work. Personal growth, having new experiences to grow and develop, working, vacation, traveling, et cetera. And then revitalization. So when companies understand these 5 key values about the disability market, they're hitting it right on all notes. Discretionary income for working age people with disabilities is about $21 billion, which is greater than the African American and Hispanic markets combined. So again, that flies in the face that folks don't have money or discretionary income to spend. We have proven to be extremely brand loyal to companies that understand our needs. Next slide, please. So with all this data, and I don't mean to just data dump and just leave you there, but with all this data, you begin to ask questions. Why aren't companies targeting people with disabilities as employees and consumers? And then what does the C-suite need to know about the disability market so that changes? How do we convey the value of the market to C-suite executives in a way that resonates with them to take action? Next slide, please. Now we're going to dive in. So some of the things that we've heard, and I know many of you would have probably heard some of these in your organizations, that senior managers and senior leaders say about disability inclusion. We can't find qualified candidates with disabilities. I know if I did a poll right now, I think I would see, a lot of responses to that one. We scored 100 on the Disability Equality Index. We're doing well, we're fine. And again, this is not a critical comment about the index. It's an excellent benchmarking for companies to really understand where they are internally. However, an index is just the beginning. And for many companies and corporate leaders, and I've had these conversations, they'll check that box and say, we're good, and nothing changes. We're compliant with the Department of Labor's OFCCP requirements, we're good. Okay, so that's again a compliance focus. We accommodate any employee who expresses the need for accommodation. So again, they're putting the onus on the employee to feel comfortable to self-disclose, and they're saying, well, we'll focus on accommodating. We don't have the budget for disability inclusion. Usually there's some comment about what it will cost. And we can create a disability inclusion initiative at the national level, and I've heard this recently, but we can't control what happens locally. So in other words, we can do all this from headquarters, but really what happens in the regions and key markets, that's going to be what the reality is. And we don't have anyone there to take care of it, finding candidates for us or being out in the community. So these are some of the things that we've been hearing over the years from leaders in terms of why they're not moving or how they're just saying, we're good, we're okay. So let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So what we're hearing from employees with disabilities is that many of them are experiencing a negative bias in the workplace, and the more visible their disability is, the more likely there is to be bias. I give a whole talk on unconscious bias, and it's really one of those things that still permeates companies where it becomes a roadblock and hindrance for many people, many of us, to be successful inside of organizations. Many employees with disabilities experience being excluded from their colleagues in terms of decision-making, work assignments, social activities, etc. Many are misjudged, in terms of their knowledge and their skills, their talent. And also linked to that, many are underestimated. There have been instances, and I've done training for companies where they've had issues where employees were insulting other employees with disabilities. And oftentimes, many people are avoided. I'll add to that, there are folks who are just installed careers. So they get in the organization, but once they get in, they just stay there. And I think, for the hiring manager, maybe even for HR team, they feel like, what, we did what we're supposed to do. And there's not ongoing discussions about career and growth and professional development. Those are just some of the things that we're hearing from employees and what they experience. Next slide. So when we talk about, now we're going to get into the nitty gritty. When we talk about the disability business case, first we got to talk about overcoming obstacles to get buy-in. So some of the tactics that you may hear are focused on, and this will kill any disability inclusion effort, fear, and that, that can be laced and messaged around bias. People just don't know, they can't change what they won't confront, and there's just some underlying fear, fear of litigation, fear of, not getting it right, fear of saying the wrong thing. There can also be confusion because, as we all know, disability is very ranging and broad and nuanced, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. And so for many corporate leaders, they may have confusion around invisible disabilities and, is that person really disabled? They may have confusion around how do they accommodate, et cetera. There may even be ridicule. I don't hear that as much from corporate partners and also companies I've worked with. But the one that is the killer of all killers is death by delay. We'll get to that next year. Honestly, companies do have to plan and they have to budget, but there can be this ongoing death by delay in terms of decision making, getting all the stakeholders involved to finally just make a decision that we're going to start. Next slide, please. So in order to really begin, it's important to identify the gaps in policies and processes in terms of all the internal processes and administrative functions in employment and marketing, customer service, et cetera. It's also important to identify what's working, what isn't working, where are those gaps, right? Identify who the allies are internally, who are the stakeholders. There may be people who are engaged in disability inclusive activities with their family outside of work, but they don't talk about it at work because they don't feel there's a culture for it. So, find out who those stakeholders and allies are. Identify the most resistant leaders and influencers, and I'll add, begin to just have candid conversations with them about what they're resistant about. What is it about disability inclusion and around employment, marketing, or customer service that makes them more resistant? And then identify the senior executives you have access to. So begin to have those conversations because those will be the influencers that will help create the dialogue in rooms and in the C-suite and meetings that you're not a part of, who can begin to influence and impact. Next slide, please. So talk about what's in it, and executives want to know, okay? So this is a nice thing to do, but basically what's in it for me, what's in it for you personally, what's in it for the executive. So, you can present to them, you have the opportunity to impact the company, you can transform the company, make it clear to them how they will benefit by becoming an influencer within the organization around disability inclusion. It's also important for you, those of you inside of companies that are driving this process or allies, to understand what's in it for you as well. What's in it for them? So the them could really focus on two key areas. So it could focus on the leaders, what's in it for them to become more engaged. And it's also focused on what's in it for them, the disability community. Be very clear in outlining what the benefit is there. What's in it for us as an organization? How can we change? How can we promote what we're doing? How can we change our culture through employment? Really building a strong infrastructure to support all of our employees. And then what's in it for all? That is, where you want to land. How do we benefit by locking arms with disability organizations, our business resource group, our HR, diversity, marketing, guest experience? How do we benefit as an organization? How do we become better by focusing on what's in it for all? Next slide, please. So in order to make this shift, you've heard me say this word a few times, we have to move from compliance to competitive. And organizations that begin with compliance-based, that are compliance-based focus there instead of a competitive focus. So if you're compliance-focused, you focus on tracking, sourcing talent, getting existing populations to self-identify, ensuring compliance for customers. If you're focused on being competitive, you shift, the questions you ask are, what are we doing to retain talent? How do we better engage our existing employees? And what are we doing to segment and target customers with disabilities and influencers? You see how that's different? It's more culture focused, it's more on growth opportunities, and it's really rolling up our sleeves and taking a deeper dive than just checking a box. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to go through this question. We'll repeat the same process. I hope more of you will find an answer. So historically, would you say that your organization has viewed disability inclusion from a compliance-based focus or a competitive-based focus? A, compliance-based, B, competitive-based. We'll take a few seconds to answer. Okay, so most of you have said compliance-based, and a small number of you, only 12% of you, said competitive-based. So again, hopefully what we share will arm you to shift the conversation side to get to those C-suite and executives. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So, you know what, when we talk through disability inclusion, I want you all to hear this loudly. When we talk about it, it's about growth and it's about opportunity. It's a growth opportunity for the organization. If you focus solely on this is to do or disability, I heard it recently this week, hiring people with disabilities, it's the right thing to do. Okay, that will fall flat like lead in a balloon. That will not work to change not only the lives of people who have the skill and talent to work, but it definitely will not change what's happening inside those companies. Disability inclusion primarily focuses on recruitment, reputation management, and again, checking of the boxes. So what are those opportunities? If that's where you all are and it's compliance focused, how can you develop in terms of your corporate reputation, in terms of how you recruit employees, and then expand beyond checking off the boxes? If I don't say anything else, this third bullet is really important. Identify disability inclusion, as an opportunity, focuses on outcomes and results in metrics, not optics. I'm going to say it again. Focus on how disability inclusion can lead to outcomes and not fully focus on optics. And then, most importantly, and I put problem in quotes, but it's not really supposed to be delivered, shared with you negatively. Know what problem or internal issue or pain point disability inclusion solves for your company. Why does your company need a disability inclusion plan that's comprehensive? And what's the solution it's solving? So for instance, if you're seeing a high rate of turnover, then it's important to focus on reaching this group of employees to help fill that employment gap. But solely focusing on it because it's the right thing to do, it won't be sustainable. I hope that makes sense. So again, focus on outcomes, not optics. Next slide, please. It's also important that you think of your disability inclusion effort as a business. So it's important that you plan, that you have project management, that there's operational excellence, again, that there's leadership and team engagement and stakeholder management and a business focus, and lastly, accountability. So those C-suite executives want to know, beyond the data that we shared earlier, beyond the quote, it's the right thing to do, how can we integrate this into our business where it functions throughout our enterprise as a critical priority for our company? And these are the key elements to make sure you've integrated. That last one, I cannot emphasize enough. There has to be accountability and there has to be metrics and results. And we'll go through that in a few minutes because I've given you all a pretty exhaustive list of metrics that you can consider to use within your organization. Next slide. All right, so some of the key elements or program areas to make sure are integrated into disability inclusion include training and education, which seems like a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised how many organizations do not train their folks not only to provide better service or to be able to understand at the HR and diversity level what they need to address around employment facilities. That makes sense in terms of accessibility of physical structures. Marketing and customer service, how are they interplaying with what we're doing inside the company? Also making sure that there's a process in place to address accommodations, a recruitment plan that's robust and doesn't just focus on one virtual career fair, but really drills deeper into key markets or into schools through their disability student services and career services. And then what is our process to hire folks with disabilities or candidates, onboard employees, and then to retain them? So, these are some key elements that you might want to consider as you're building out your engagement process with internal stakeholders. That's what C-suite folks will want to know. If they say, you have our support, now who do we get involved? This is just a sample list of things to consider and teams, internal teams to invite to the discussion. All right, next slide, please. All right, now we talked about outcomes, not optics. So let's measure our effectiveness. The metrics will vary from company to company based on priorities, but it's really, really important that you understand what the business's priorities are and consider some of the following. So collaborate with your senior leaders to help define and co-create what metrics are in place. So it's not enough for you to, it's a starting point to say, you know what, this is what OFCCP requires, but how can we go further than that and get that senior leaders buy-in and support? It's important, and we talked about this, how to articulate the value proposition about disability inclusion as well as to your peers. So when you share with your executives, it's important for them to understand there's a value proposition. It gets back to that's what's in it for us. It's also important to broker client and community partnership opportunities. I can't stress that enough. Where the real credibility comes in your outreach efforts in employment and marketing is how you engage the community locally, statewide, and nationally. And I'll add to this, again, on my little soapbox here, engagement doesn't mean you just write a check, as I mentioned before, and it doesn't mean you just attend an event. Engagement means that you lock arms with these community leaders, and you identify opportunities to work together that creates a win-win. So it requires some give and take, or mutual benefit. It's also important to integrate the goals and metrics within the business. How will we know we have reached our goals? So you got to have established the goals. That, again, getting back to that first bullet, what do you define and co-create with your senior leaders in terms of metrics? What will be our tangible results? It's really straightforward. What will we have changed? So if we're talking about, we want to increase employment, or self-ID, or build a business, create a business resource group for employees with disabilities as well as family members, 2 separate business resource groups, what will have changed? Is there a plan in place? So again, some questions to consider. Do we have an annual survey of our BRG members to understand what's working and what isn't? So a lot of times companies will create business resource group, but they don't go back to these employees and try to gauge from them have we given you enough capacity and support to be effective, what's working and what isn't. So for example, by October 31st, we want to review X number and deliver a set of recommendations to Y, or we will connect with W and co-sponsor a lecture about whatever topic. By 2019, we will communicate monthly with HR about available positions that share referrals from our business resource group or community partners. Again, just beginning to assign metrics will begin to not only build credibility for what you're presenting to your executives, but also will help drive business growth and opportunity. Next slide, please. Additional metrics to consider are the number of events that are co-sponsored with other business resource groups, the African American group, the women's group, the LGBTQ group, that could generate new business. There's also the intersectionality, so that's another important reason to create those collaborations. Also, the number of presentations by BRG members within their professional specialty. So, we want to track how many times members of our business resource group present on XYZ topic related to their field, just as a metric that may be, a benefit to the company. The number of business relationships that are secured. So if you become a community partner, you also want that to drive business growth. The number of community partnerships, or the level of structure and governance, another metric to consider. The revenue and business aligned targets, and then the recognition received. And I see a lot of companies stay right with this last bullet. What's our recognition nationally, regionally, or globally? And that's excellent. But I always want the companies that engage with NBDC, or the companies that I've worked with, to make sure that if any consumer, any person in the disability community sees XYZ business, I won't name one, but if they see that business, that when they peel back the layers, they see that there's substantive growth opportunities and market opportunities and business focus aligned with disability inclusion within that enterprise. Next slide, please. So additional metrics to consider. I told you I'd provide a lot. It's important to inform and engage in a list your executive sponsors to help the business resource group become an advancement platform for employment or for innovation. It's also important to become become a cultural competency engine to fuel better intelligence for executives, so they understand what are the cultural competencies around disability inclusion that will help drive the process, because executives may not have a knowledge of what those are. And actually, NBDC's team is in the process of developing some core cultural competencies focused on disability inclusion. If you want to know more about that, reach out to Scott Wright, who started off our webinar. Incorporate development activities of leaders in the talent and recruitment process, so making sure that the recruitment team, the talent, has an understanding of not only, I'm of the belief that people have to understand, have some context, not just understand the candidate. So let's have some context, some historical understanding, knowledge of the laws, what is required by us as an employer, but then to understand and, take a deeper dive to understand candidates with disabilities. The business resource group members serve as ambassadors during new employee orientation. So that's easy. So if you have employees that you're onboarding and they've disclosed they have a disability, it would be really great to have, the BRG members, not in a conspicuous way, but in a supportive way, just reach out and just, let them know, try to engage them to become part of the BRG, and also, to be a ally within the organization. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, completing an annual survey of BRG members in terms of identifying what's working and what isn't. Okay, I'm going to take a pause. Next slide, please. There's even more. So clearly define mentoring opportunities and protocols for employees with disabilities. It's really, really important that as your organization discusses mentoring, that you don't leave employees with disabilities behind. Tracking the number of referrals for candidates who have disabilities, tracking the number and retention of new hires who were referred through internal and external network or community partnerships, the number of sponsored job fairs or affinity-related business events, the number of BRG members participating in community outreach, the increase in sales attributed to disability-focused campaigns, and then lead generation and business development results and recognition from consumers. I think I've given you a pretty comprehensive and exhaustive list to get you started. These are the metrics and measurements that executives will want to know beyond it's the right thing to do, or we're just checking the box. They're going to want to understand the growth opportunity and how it will be tracked. I hope that makes sense. Let's go on to the next slide. So when we talk about, once you have gotten a senior executive, supportive, senior executives, not just one, let's hope that there are many, actively engaged and you have their attention, it's important to shift from influencing to implement, because all of this is really good to know. This information is good to know, but if we don't implement, that's not gonna lead us where we need to go. So in terms of creating a disability inclusion team that will drive the process internally. So this is different than just the business resource group. Although members of the business resource group can be a part of this team, it's important that there's a team that's put in place to help drive the process forward. So the responsibility of this team is to learn about local disability inclusion strategies and discuss and propose solutions. And then creating a pilot. In some cases, a pilot is a good starting point. Disability inclusion program for key market or regional implementation. So for instance, one of the companies that I've worked with is standing up a local, they're headquartered in a specific state. They're setting up a local, they call it a council, but it's their disability-focused BRG, with the goal of rolling this out nationally and globally. But recognize they have to start locally, and they want to start locally in headquarters. So that's a good place to start, which influences the opportunity for global impact. So when we discuss implementation, how will our disability inclusion team ensure that action is being taken by local diversity and HR staff, advocates, and other stakeholders. So what we want to focus on, and the responsibility of the team for implementation is, once we've done the influencing, we move to implementation, implement diversity initiatives and disability inclusion, measure progress, which, we went through that extensive list, ensure open two-way communication of local perception successes and challenges between local stakeholders and the Diversity or Disability Council. So again, that measurement, that implementation piece are critical, but also having that two-way communication is also important. Next slide, please. So we're getting close to the end. So here's where the corporate goodwill happens. This is where what you've built inside of your organization leads to a really positive outcome, with 92% of consumers saying that they favorably perceive companies that hire people with disabilities. And that works across the board. It's not just those of us in the disability community, but the general market responds favorably to companies that hire people with disabilities. 30% of the general market prefer to give their business to companies that employ people with disabilities. So why that's important, pretty self-evident, is that basically it drives market growth, not only with the disability market, but also with the general market. Again, we talked earlier about opportunity and growth linked to business goals, and that is the conversation that executives want to have. Next slide, please. So in closing, and I am of a firm belief that, all of this information is helpful, all of this information is useful, but it doesn't mean anything if it's not acted upon. So what is one thing you all can do, each of you can do, when this webinar ends, to engage your senior executives and begin to get their buy-in? And who do you need to engage, a senior executive, and also your peers, to help advance disability inclusion throughout the enterprise? And those are questions that I hope you'll take a moment to just think through and answer, and then get back to us and let us know how successful you've been. The next slide, please. So we're going to open the floor for any questions, and if any of you have any, you type them in the box. I think this is where I hand off to Scott, but type them in the box, and I'll do my best to answer the questions you have. And if I can't answer it, I will get the answer and get back to you. But before we head off, if no one has any, thank you so much for spending an hour of your Thursday with us. We hope that some of what we shared here is helpful. I know it was a lot of information, but I also hope that it was substantive and that it can be acted upon. And again, if you're interested in learning more, if you're a corporate partner at NBDC, please reach out to Scott so we can support you in a more robust way. And then if you're not, we would love to chat with you about your organization and see if we can help drive inclusion within your company. So if there are questions, fire away.
So Carmen, this is Scott Wright once again. Can you give us a little bit of insight or far as trends that you see regarding with executives, like what has been changed that you've seen over the past 5 or even 20 years?
Well, the biggest trend, I started doing this work 20 plus years ago. And, when I initially started, it was shortly after the ADA passed and became law. And it was really a compliance exercise, and companies just wanted to stay out of, the legal hairs. So that has been a shift. I've noticed a lot of companies are being very proactive in terms of doing market research so they can understand how to serve guests and customers better and how to message well. There's a lot of focus on making sure that the messaging is right. I've attended a number of photo shoots with companies that want to have stock photography in their marketing and creative team to use with real models with disability. So there's an authenticity that companies recognize. They recognize too that the community will become very critical. We can sniff out the inauthenticity and have taken to Twitter to let folks know. And so companies really want to take good faith effort or make good faith effort to be authentic in terms of how they engage with consumers and candidates. And that's come with senior level support. I've also noticed, and this hasn't been as pervasive, but it's something I have noticed, that more executives either are self-identifying, they feel more comfortable self-identifying that they have a disability, at least with the companies I've worked with, or that they have a child who has a disability. And, up until probably 5-10 years, people kept that part of their life very separate and private. But now, because the cultures are shifting, people are slowly becoming a bit more comfortable self-identifying or disclosing.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Since we have, a few minutes left, this is the opportunity for you to summarize your presentation, and if you can, pretty much summarize NBDC, how they can help some of our corporate partners and some of those who are not corporate partners as yet, and some of the things that we plan on doing with this webinar series.
Sure. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the National Business and Disability Council at the Freddie Center I didn't say, but it is over 20 years old and has worked with companies for a number of years, corporate partners. And so we not only want to be a resource and provide information and convenings and events, but we see ourselves as a partner to help companies become more successful in their disability inclusive efforts. So some of our programming and services have shifted and grown. We're planning an executive roundtable this fall in the Southwest, most likely Atlanta. We have a job posting service. We have created targeted employment outreach where we work with community-based organizations within a 50-mile radius of 15 key markets to really help push out vacancy announcements and help build relationships at the local level. We have accessibility services, not only providing assessments for physical space, but also document remediation. We have a highly successful Emerging Leaders program for college students with disabilities that a lot of companies are really excited about and have partnered with, and building relationships with interns to help drive talent. We help and advise our corporate partners in developing their disability inclusive strategic plan. We will be rolling out a series of webinars, and we will also be rolling out for HR professionals 6 key areas of the 6 competency areas that are focused solely on disability inclusion, and that will be coming in the form of a training for corporate partners. So we're really excited about supporting the companies that are engaged with us, and also those who haven't become corporate partners yet, just serving as a resource.
All right, thank you. I just got one more question that just came in, if you don't mind. I know we're cutting on time, but so here's the question. Please discuss the importance of including a specialist, for example, an occupational therapist, to help identify reasonable accommodations that will truly be effective and reasonable.
Well, the importance for that is that the person has the knowledge and the skill and the ability and the expertise to not to diagnose and to support, and I don't say diagnose in a medical sense, but to really identify what the needs of an employee are. So in addition to utilizing the job accommodation network, it's important, if companies are seriously committed, to use the services of someone on their team, to hire someone on their team as an employee that can really spend time not only building relationships with those who have self-identified, but also, presence will encourage those who may be hanging back and not wanting to self-disclose that they have a disability, that it's safe to do so. So that's an important element to have in place, which builds credibility and culture change.
Okay, great, great. All right, everyone. Once again, I want to applaud and thank Carmen Jones for her presentation today. You did a phenomenal job. Thank you very much. Hopefully you'll come back again and do another presentation in the future.
Yep.
Everyone, as we said in the beginning, you will receive a survey at the end of this presentation. Carmen, any last words before we sign off?
Nope. The only thing I would say is focus on outcomes, not optics. Focus on metrics and opportunity for business growth. If you do that and change the conversation from nice to do and it's good to do to business, to driving business and growth, the executives will begin to take notice.
All right. Thank you very much, Carmen. Thank you very much, everyone. And we look forward to hearing back from you in the survey, and we look forward to next month's webinar. You'll receive an email and an invite, and hope to see you guys join that as well. Have a good afternoon.